Now, to briefly catch up from where the last episode dropped off, all the paint is on, the decals are on, and everything's been sealed in with an acrylic gloss coat. I used Vallejo gloss varnish, but any gloss varnish will do. People often email me or message me, and they want to know specifically what I use, and which fine, but for a purpose like this, just a gloss coat is good. Whatever you like, whatever you have on hand. Gloss coat is gloss coat. So anyway, I want to get some panel line washes applied now. For this, I'm going to be using AK Interactive's Dark Streaking Grime. I like it because it's, well, one, it's dark, but two, it's got kind of a browny, greeny look that will work well with this model. And it just looks kind of dirtyish. There's still going to be other steps to weather it, but this will just contribute to the end game. I never ever shake my enamel washes or anything like that. I give them a stir with this electric stir tool. That gets them good and mixed up and doesn't get the wash up in the threads of the bottle so that it locks up. Now I've put a little of the wash in my palette here. I'm just going to use this liner brush to just apply it like that. I didn't thin it out. It's a little thick, but I'd prefer that because it gives me more intense color than if I thinned it out a lot and had it flow nicely. But it might break up the color or just be too, the opacity would not be what I want. If you're ever putting on your washes and when you're done with it, it appears that the washes have almost, the pigments have broken apart. It's kind of splotchy looking. Means it's over thinned. So that's what causes that. I see it all the time in YouTube videos that somebody will show a close-up of their model, and I'll see the panel line washes are kind of, it's just like there'll be some color and then there'll be none, and then there'll be color and then there'll be none. It just looks splotchy. Should be nice and solid. So by using it this way, it'll help me keep that looking like I want. I'll just go around and apply this on all of the surfaces, upper and lower. I tend to work one section at a time. I'll do this wing and then I'll do the other wing and so forth. But if you're going to be doing it as long as you're doing it in one session, you could potentially do the entire model, because I have to work in essentially short 20 to 25 minute bursts each day before I head off to work. I tend to do smaller sections. Now for flat, wide open surfaces like this, you can use a Q-tip. I've done that, but I've gotten where I prefer just taking a piece of paper towel, just starting off by wiping it that way. Now it's not going to get up all of it, but it's going to get up a bunch of it. And then I can evaluate where I need to do extra cleanup. This is dry, by the way. This is not, I don't have any thinner on here or anything like that. It's dry. Now you can see how that turned out, and just compare it to the other wing. It's a fairly subtle difference, but it definitely makes the panel lines stand out, but it's not too stark. That's what I wanted. I didn't want them really super stark. Now, certainly if you do this and you see that there's a panel line that you want to add a little more color to, like I'm looking at this one, I'm thinking I may go back and put a little more in right there. Then, certainly do that. doesn't hurt to add additional color around, say, the ailerons or something like that if you want those to stand out a little more. If you wanted a more stark look, then going with a darker brown or a black wash would certainly be fine. It's completely up to you, of course, but it just helps the panel lines stand out a little bit. If I would have had trouble getting any of it up, I could have put a drop of my odorless thinner onto the paper towel here and just kind of folded it around on that. You don't want to soak it, but just an area that's just damp with it would have pulled stuff like that right up. And then if there were areas that you really needed to kind of specifically focus on, a Q-tip would do it. But I'll go around and do the rest of the aircraft and then take it from there. I put on a coat of satin varnish. This is from VMS, but I mean, really, any satin varnish that you like will work fine. Now, the reason I went from a gloss coat to a satin varnish is the weathering steps I'm going to be doing next will work best over a satin varnish. I'm going to be doing some oil work, some acrylic work, that kind of thing, and over a gloss varnish, those just simply might not stick well enough. If you're trying to do oil streaking, if it's a gloss varnish, you'll probably just pull it right off. But with a satin varnish, the oils are going to be able to get some kind of grip, so when you blend it away, streak it back, whatever the technique is, it's going to have some grip, and it's going to allow me to work like I want. All right, I want to start doing some chipping on the model. And aircraft chipping is an area that I have to generally restrain myself in. When I'm doing, one of the things I loved about making the shift from aircraft to, say, Warhammer and machining Krieger is I could chip things all day long. Put as much chipping as I want. Use a wide variety of colors and just really go to town on it. With an aircraft, I mean, certainly you can do that, but I feel like it works better, especially with historical aircraft, to base it in reality, to look at photos of the actual thing and see what they had. Now, a lot of these P-39s, you look at some photos of P-39s, they were chipped up, especially the ones that were used as training aircraft in the U.S. To train fighter pilots, because they had just crews, pilots going through them week after week after week after week after week. They got really, really chipped up and quite worn looking. I mean, as long as they flew relatively safely, that was the main thing. In a combat zone, an aircraft, they generally, especially in Europe, but as the war went on, because there were so many replacements available, a lot of times it was easier if an aircraft had a problem to just pull it off the line, roll in a new one, and either declare the other one, unserviceable, or send it to a depot, or, not keep using it. And so a lot of times they didn't get as worn. Now, early on, where this would have been in the South Pacific, they got very worn because there weren't a lot of replacements. So you just look at photos, do some reading about your subject, and it'll help you decide how much chipping to do. Now, for chipping aircraft, I actually like to use these pencils like this. For years, I used the Prismacolor silver pencil, and at some point I picked up one of these AK pencils in the color aluminum. Either one of these work well. They're essentially the same. I've done some testing with them, and there are differences in what you can do with them after they're on the model in terms of streaking and water blending and things like that. The AK one is a little more flexible. But for chipping, either one of these will work. And you may recall, if you've watched a lot of my videos, I normally don't chip things with silver, just plain silver, because it looks like on a tank or on a sci-fi subject, it may look too stark. And stylistically, I prefer to use other colors. But on an aircraft, if you look at most photos, they're very clearly chipped down to metal, and they're chipped where it tends to be like on the wing walks, people walking on and off of that. It polishes it, it cleans it up, so it doesn't necessarily get dirty. There can be dirt, of course, but it's not again, it's not like a tank. It's not like a Warhammer model. It's not like some kind of mech. So I always keep that in mind. And realism wise, if you look at an aircraft, there tends to be, except for say the wing root areas or areas where they're servicing the weapons or something like that, it tends to be fairly small chipping. Again, look at your photos. If you're trying to replicate a particular aircraft, it may have conditions or things going on that it may be more chipped. There were some of the Japanese aircraft that the paint just didn't cling to it, and it just came off in droves. I read a story one time of a squadron of F-4F Wildcats that were flying from an aircraft carrier to one of the islands in the Solomon Island chain, and they had to fly through a hailstorm as they were on their way. And when they landed, the writer, who was one of the pilots, said that it had stripped most of the paint back on the front third of the aircraft. He said just the leading edges of the wings and the nose, a third of it back was just gone. So, there can be a lot of chipping. I tend to not do hairspray chipping on an aircraft because it tends to over chip it, in my opinion. But again, you do whatever you want to do. So I like the pencils. They're very easy to control. They're very easy to apply. They're very easy to build up. And they work very well. I've done brush chipping and sponge chipping. Those work well. But sponge chipping tends to build up really fast. You get a lot of chipping really quickly, Whereas with this, you're getting dots. So as you'll see in a second, it just kind of provides me with some restraint that I normally don't have with chipping. Now, there's nothing that says once you get it on there that you can't paint other colors over it to tone it down, to change it a little bit, to put a wash over it. Certainly when I put a matte coat on at the end, it's going to dull these down, which is something I'm counting on. These are a bit bright, so counting on them getting dulled down just a little bit. Now I'm going to start over here on the wing root on the right side, because this is the side on a P-39 that most pilots got in and out of, not exclusively. But on the left side, the throttle quadrant stuck out a little bit right here. And pilots, I've read, pilots said that they quite often would bang their knees against it. So they tended to get in on the right side. So most aircraft, you're going to see the left side chipped at the wing root, because that's where the pilots get on and off. On these, it was the right side, but the procedure's the same per side. Now, usually the trailing edge of the wing was just worn down to just pretty much bare metal. So I'm going to start off with that. Now, I can do it in this kind of pointillism method like that. You can, on something like this, just color it in like that. Speeds things up. Don't overdo it is my recommendation. And then once you get it where you want it, add some additional chipping like that around it to kind of blend it a little bit like that. And I chip over the decals, just right over them. And then I just go up and I start doing more of this. Now I prefer to kind of do it more light in some areas, although along these lines like this where the panels would be, there's going to be more. And then just bring it all the way up there. A lot of these, it went right up to the leading edge of the wing, because, you know, the pilots would be up there, the crew would later come up there to service it, because they had to stand here to, and even though they weren't, you know, it was supposed to be a cautionary, they would stand here to service up here. So you do that like this. And they didn't always stay precisely on the wing walks. So the wing walks would wear away quite often. So I just start putting it in. You notice I'm holding the pencil back further from the, not right up on it like that, like I'm writing, but further back. I'm just kind of tapping. I'm not even really using that much pressure. There is a little pressure, but just tapping like that. And then in some areas, if I want to make it more prominent, I can go in and just draw it in like that. Another thing I like doing sometimes is just like scribbling back and forth like that, just to introduce more chipping. It's a very precise method, and I think it ends up looking pretty good. Here, let me refocus and show you up close. You can see here how that looks, and it's not as, I think sponge chipping is a little more random, but sponge chipping is a little bigger. This is a little more precise. So I think it looks better at distance than right up close, but it's a good method, and I've used it on hundreds of aircraft over the years, and I've tried other methods, and I keep coming back to this now just to show that there's not a whole lot of difference between the two. This is the AK pencil. I was using, I think, the Prismacolor pencil. I don't even remember now, but either one of these works just fine. And of course, you can do chipping in other areas, like areas where they would service the guns. Those little bolts there, let me get this on camera. Those little bolts there, they would have to undo each of those to get to the guns. So those tend to get chipped more than the rest of it. So they can go in and they can service the guns, pull the guns out, clean the guns, put in ammunition, all of that. So those areas tend to get chipped. And then of course when they're coming over here, they're walking along the wing, they're having to be on the wing, so there may be some chipping there. And again, look at photos to decide how extensive you want that. You know, here where it gets filled up with fuel, there's going to be some like that. So, you know, and there's nothing that says you can't have a little more of a, you know, maybe somebody dropped their wrench and it developed a paint chip there like that. If you've got a decal, if you've got some silvering in a decal, you know, put some chipping over it. Anything like that. So let me continue with this process. It's going to take a while. Now I'm continuing with the chipping, but I'm going to show you something that I normally don't do it this way on camera, but I thought I'd show it just to introduce the idea in case it was helpful. When I'm on camera, I tend to, like if I'm doing the chipping, I do the chipping and I get that done. And then I go to the next step, whatever that may be. And then I get that done. Because it works better for filming. But when I'm doing things off camera, when I'm just working in my normal workflow, quite often I work in sections. Or I may do things in the middle of doing another thing because it makes sense at that point to do it that way. So, like, for example, right here, you got this fuel filler cap. And I'm chipping around this and I'm working around this. And I thought, let me go ahead and do that. Because it accomplishes several things. One, it gets the fuel stain in there. But two, I put it on and then I just continue working around it. And some may go over it and some may be underneath it. Because that's the way it would be for real. In that you know, there might be some chipping, and then they fill it up with fuel, and then there might be some chipping, and then they fill it up with fuel, and so it just goes back and forth. It's not like, if it were real, it's not like the plane gets chipped and then gets stained. It's a continual ongoing process. So doing steps in the middle of steps, putting things over things continually, can be a little more realistic. Now what I've got here is a Citadel shade. It's called Targor Rageshade. This is, don't worry about the name. It's just a name. It's an acrylic wash. Now remember, with oils and enamels, those are subtractive in nature. You put them on and then you use thinners to blend them away. With acrylic washes, you don't blend them as much. You can't use them the same way. They're an additive process. And so I tend to put them on in smaller amounts. But I like this Targor Rageshade color for fuel stains because for some reason it just looks right to me. And all I'm going to do is just go in and just tap some of this on like that, just to get some staining around there. And then I'm just going to get a little bit of water here in my palette before this stuff dries too much. I'm just going to thin it out. Now it will do what is often called tea staining, coffee staining, but for this purpose, that's what I want. And so in the middle of this, I'm just going to put a little more like that, let it flow around like that. And if you're going to use this, just experiment with it. You have a test model out, get that out, and see how it looks to you. And I quite often do this multiple times so that it looks, again, you know, layered up and things like that. And it makes it a little more realistic. Let me grab my old hair dryer here and dry this off and show you how that looks. And you can see when that dries, it's very subtle. Now I'm going to put more layers on, actually. But you can see that it's just a very subtle effect. And by adding additional layers and not necessarily trying to match everything in terms of its placement, then it gives a much more varied look and helps contribute to the realism. This stuff will dry less opaque, I guess I should say, than when it initially goes on. So experimentation will kind of lead the way. But I just keep doing this a few times, and I can do it throughout the course. As I talked about earlier, I can do it throughout the course of the build, not just at one point in time, but adding stains throughout the process, and then continuing to weather and do other things. And it gives a depth of finish. It gives a realism that the model may not, you know, if you just do it in just a rote linear fashion, may not necessarily impart on the model. So I could use oils here, I could use enamels here, I could use anything here. So don't get hung up on this. I like this because, one, because of the color, two, because it's acrylic and I can dry it out really quick and keep working. So the product you use, of course, is up to you, but I like this for those reasons. The airfields that these aircraft operated out of were very muddy. They may have put some of the steel planking down over it, but it wasn't always the case that they operated out of a paved airstrip. It may have been crushed rock, it may have been crushed coral, it may have been the PSP steel planking. It may have been just dirt. So and especially along the taxiways and the revetments where they parked, those quite often were, except for the revetments maybe, were dirt. And because of the rain in the area, they were often mud. So I like to account for that underneath the wings where you've seen if you drive your car through a puddle, it just splashes water everywhere. Well, if you were driving a plane, taxiing a plane or taking off or landing on a muddy airfield, there's going to be some mud along there, and it would get thrown not only here but forward too because of the way the wheel spins. So I want to try and account for that, and the way I like doing that, one of the ways, is I like using this Vallejo model wash. Now I could use, again, this is one of those areas, I could use oils, I could use enamels, I could use pigments, I could use this. I've done all of that. Sometimes I do a combination of them to get some multiple colors in. I'm going to keep it simple on this one and just use this European Dust model wash. Now on my palette I have the Vallejo model wash, thinned it half and half with water. You don't have to thin it that much. Experiment with it. It goes on more opaque than when it dries, and so I, as with anything, test it unthinned, heavily thinned, medium thinned. After a while you'll get to where how it is you want to work. Now I could apply, I could do this with speckling, where you take a brush and say a toothpick and you just kind of speckle it like that. That's going to sling about a little more than I want. Not that this plane wouldn't get that muddy on the underside, but sometimes I feel like weathering is not necessarily a 100% realistic endeavor, but I don't know if this is the right word because it sounds a little weird in this I mean, it doesn't, but it does. It's a suggestive context, meaning you don't want to cover the entire thing with mud because that may give you a more harsh look than you want. So if you just put mud in strategic locations, it suggests mud that's not necessarily there. So that's why I say suggestive. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply this with, instead of a brush or something like that, I'm going to use this sponge. Now, one of the things to keep in mind, let me rephrase that. One of the things I keep in mind when I'm doing a sponge application is if I put some on and just keep going over it, it's just going to blend it together. Now, if that's what I'm looking to do, then that's fine. But if I want distinct spots, in other words, if I want to put on a sponge layer that's a little lighter, that has distinct spots, then what I have to do is put it on, dry it with a hair dryer, or take the time to let it air dry, and then put on another layer. Those spots will shine through. So you would want to consider, I always consider, do I want to do more of a wet application or what I would call a dry application, in that I let it dry between layers. So I'm going to get some on my sponge here, and I'm going to sponge off a good bit of that. And I'm going to put that on, and I'm giving it a fair amount of pressure. Looks like I sponged off a little too much. Sometimes when you first dip the sponge in, when it's dry, it doesn't, and you tap it off on the paper, or on the paper towel, it takes off more than you want. So you may have to do it twice. Now, what I'm going to do, and I'll go ahead and do this other side too. Now notice I'm not doing it over here because the wheels are going to be here. Keep that in mind. One time I saw somebody that they'd seen I did this, and they put all of their mud here because when the wheels were closed up, that's where the wheels were, and they were thinking here. And they said, "What do you think?" Now, I didn't have the heart to poke too much fun at it, and I just basically said, "Yeah, you may want to think about where the mud actually gets slung." And they came back and they were like, "Oh man, I didn't even think about that." But you can see how quickly that dried. And I mean, it's still drying, but it dries fairly quickly. That's why I like using this versus oils or enamels or something like that, is that fast drying time. So let me grab my hair dryer and dry this off, and then I'll do another layer. Now, after hitting it with the hair dryer, not literally, of course, you can see how that looks. And it's a lot more subtle. Like I said, this stuff goes on far more opaque than it dries, especially when you thin it with water. But now I can put more over that, and it won't blend that away. Now, is it going to make a major amount of difference? Not really. You could do it all wet and let it dry like that, and do it one time, and it'll show up just fine. Sometimes I think I like to do things more because of how I imagine it's going to look rather than how it ends up looking. You see here, I'm doing a second application. I'm not doing it very heavy, just putting it on. And I'm doing a little bit of blending there, but then I'll do the hair dryer again. Now, just to show a variation of application, maybe you don't have any sponges available, or you prefer to use a brush. You can just take your brush like this and do the same kind of application. It's not going to be much different. You just have to work some off on the paper towel ahead of time and put this on. One thing to note about those Vallejo washes, they settle very quickly. So before each use, I just give it a little stir with the end of a paintbrush. Now here you can see after 3 applications how that looks. I'm probably going to put a little more than that on. And I may have thinned it. For what I'm going for, I probably thinned it a little too much. But I tend to prefer to work. I'd rather do more applications and build it up so that I can get it just like I want, rather than using something thicker and putting on one application and going, oh, that's too far. So quite often I make myself do extra work, I guess you'd say, but it gives me more control. Now, I'm also going to do it here because the nose wheel would certainly throw off mud, and then I have to remember that I've got this extra fuel tank that's going to go on the bottom. So I'm going to need to account for that on this. Now, you can be nuanced about it. You could say, okay, I'm going to put it on the aircraft, and also can't forget the landing gear doors. It's got to go on both the inside and the outside of the doors, especially down here at the bottom. But you could put it on the aircraft and the doors and all that and leave it off of this, and working under the assumption that maybe this had just been put on and it's not muddy yet, and the aircraft is prepared to fly, but it hasn't flown yet. So those are all things that I think about in my preparation. Now, if you're doing this for a contest, go ahead and put the mud on the extra fuel tank, because I can guarantee you 100% that if you don't put mud on it, a judge is going to look at it and go, well, that's not consistent. And they won't take the time to use the imagination to say, maybe this had been put on pre-flight and it's still waiting to take off, and it ain't got muddy yet because it might be a brand new tank. Now, the truth is they probably would have rolled it through the mud to get it there, but you get what I'm saying. Sometimes when you're building, I don't build for contests. I never have. But sometimes when you're building for contests, you have to think what the judges are going to want to see, not necessarily what's correct or realistic or even what you like. That's why I don't build for contests. I want to build for what I like. One other note, you can do the mud back here on the tail planes if you want. I'll probably do a little light application of that, because you've seen mud, it sprays a lot. So anyway, there's that. I want to add the exhaust staining along the side of the aircraft. Now, if you look at photos of P-39s, they generally had a very light colored exhaust staining, almost white looking in photos. It probably wasn't white, it was probably a very light gray. But it tended to go from the lower edge along here and then all the way back, just kind of tapered out back here, just a slight curve to it. Now, some had darker stains, some had lighter with darker on top, some had darker with lighter on top, but the majority of them seemed to be lighter. And if you look at photos of, especially color photos of training aircraft from that period, because the P-39s were often used as fighter trainers later on in the war. Some of them had very heavy stainings, but those trainer aircraft, they got flown a lot and didn't get a huge amount of maintenance. The ones that were used in the field, their exhaust staining tended to be lighter. So I'm going to go more for that. And I'm going to just, I want to get that on there right there. But I don't want it to go on super opaque. I want to be able to control the effect. So I'm going to use, number one, I'm going to use my airbrush to do this. This is a Badger Renegade Velocity airbrush. The main thing is it's an airbrush. It has a 0.3 nozzle, but don't get too hung up on the nozzle size. I've done what I'm going to show you that this has a 0.3. What I'm going to show you with this 0.3, I've done with a 0.5 and even a 0.7. And I was happy with it either way. So don't get hung up if gee, my airbrush only has a 0.4 or 0.5 or whatever. Thinning, air pressure, and practice. You can make it all work. Trust me on that. So I've got that. Then I'm going to use Tamiya XF19 Sky Gray. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to thin it with, and you can not see the label probably, but this is alcohol. This is actually 99% isopropyl alcohol. And the reason I like using alcohol and Tamiya paints for this kind of stuff is Tamiya is very friendly to a lot of different thinners. Alcohol being one of them. I don't recommend using alcohol. Yes, you can. I know somebody's watching this. Well, but I do it. I know. I used to also. I don't recommend using this for your general coverage. I've found it to be better to use either the X20A or Mr. Color Leveling Thinner, but you do what you want. I'm just telling you what I prefer. But the combination of alcohol and the isopropyl kind, and Tamiya paints allows me to get a very, very, very low opacity and then build it up as I want to. And I think it looks really good. But again, I'm telling you what I do. You do what you want. I'm not the Mandalorian. I'm not saying this is the way. I'm saying this is a way. That's all. Now, sometimes folks ask me about thinning ratios, and they seem surprised that I don't tell them an exact number. Well, here's why. This is my alcohol, and I'm just putting some in. You see how much I put in, like that. And then I just get a brush like this. It's an old brush, and I put some paint in here, and I swirl it around like that. And I'm just making sure that it's getting off of there. Nice. And wipe that off on my t-shirt, my wife's favorite move that I do in scale modeling. She always enjoys seeing me wipe paint on my t-shirt. But you see, there it is. That's my thinning ratio. In other words, like the needle size, I don't get hung up on it. Here's why. I'm going to reach over here and turn on my compressor, and I'm going to get my handy dandy test model, and I'm just going to spray some of this on. And I'm just going to look at what it does. And that's actually too thick. So I'm going to just add some more thinner. How much thinner? Some thinner. Okay? This is why I talk about reps, repetitions, experience. Experience is going to lead the way when other things, is it 10 to 1? Is it 9 to 1? Is it 8 to 1? Is it 11 to 1 ratio? Stuff like that doesn't matter. Now I'll go in and give it another test shot. I'm barely pulling back. That's about where I want it. So we'll call that ready to go. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my little test model to kind of get the paint flowing. So I can see it on there. And then I'm just going to quickly bring it over here and start building up this effect. Very lightly, very slowly. Like that. Very subtle. That alcohol gives a great deal of control over how much paint goes on. Now you can flood it if you want to, but this just gives a nice subtle effect. Now as you add later effects, if you continue weathering the model and you add later effects, you may need to go back and punch this up a bit. Remember, weathering happens in time. It's different things happening on top of each other. But you see, I'm just building that up. I can keep building that up and make it as opaque as I want. You don't have to necessarily do both sides exactly the same. I mean, yeah, they're going to go through about the same conditions, but you may have one cylinder that's doing something weird and on one side and maybe, throwing out some black smoke or something like that, whatever you imagine. So just get it like you want. And then when you're happy with it, you call it done. And you see, I'm not getting in super close, but just keeping it back and away. If you want a more tight line, just move in a little closer. I'm doing this at 18 psi. I'm not doing this at a very low psi. 18 psi. There. That's about what I want. Now, at this low of an air pressure, you have to be really careful. If you get in and just pull back the trigger too far, you may get spidering. See how that's doing like that? I'm exaggerating it a bit. But now that may be an effect you want. I've used that effect. But it's best to start off and just kind of approach it slow and then start building it up, because you can get in very close because this alcohol evaporates really fast. Look at the fine lines, but you just keep it going, because see, let me flip it over, hang on. You can do very fine lines as you dial this in, but you have to keep it moving, because as soon as you stop, you start getting some buildup that you don't necessarily want. But again, if you practice and you test these things, then you'll know what it does, and you can make use of that. If you want to make use of that particular effect, see, a lot of times people would look at that and go, oh, that's a mistake. But I look at that and go, no, that's an effect. It's an effect that you can achieve. So a test mule model is really helpful. Let me do the other side of the exhaust staining. All right, and you can see that side. So the exhaust staining is done. I did a little heavier on this side than on this side, just slightly. Just because. Now, there've been times that, depending on the photos that I looked at and the effect that I wanted to achieve, that I would sometimes go take the airbrush and instead of just going straight back and forth, would kind of squiggle my hand and go, even if I wanted the streak to be this way from here to here, I would just let my hand, my hand shakes. So it's kind of easy to do this. And I would just go up and down and up and down and up and down like that. And then come back and do it again. And it gives a very jagged look. Some aircraft, that's how they looked. And you can replicate that pretty easy. And then, like I said, if you put a dark gray or a dark brown over that, generally what I do is if I want to put whichever color I'm going to put over the other, I make the background color a bigger area and then the foreground color within it. So if I'm going to have a background of the sky gray, I'll do that larger, and then I'll use a darker color in the middle. Now, my favorite color to use for exhaust stains is actually a color that many years ago I saw an Australian modeler by the name of Chris Walkup use, and it's, if I remember right, it's 2 parts Tamiya NATO black and 1 part whole red, or it may be 2 parts whole red and 1 part NATO black. It's been years since I used it, but I called it Walkup Brown, but it's just kind of a very dark brown, but it's got some reddish tones to it, but it's also great. It's very good for exhaust stainings, ejection port stainings and stuff like that. You can use your airbrush quite effectively for ejection port stains. I used oils on here, but you can use it for ejection port stains. You can use it for oil stains on the underside of an aircraft. The airbrush can be very good. There were many models that I built in the past when I was focusing all on aircraft that every stitch of weathering, all of it except for the chipping, was done with an airbrush. So it's possible to do all of that stuff with an airbrush. Now, in past videos, I've talked about that finishing a model is kind of a continuum. I don't see it necessarily. I mean, unless there's a certain look that I'm going for that I know ahead of time that this is the point. There's a point that I want to finish. With this one, I've been looking at it as more of a continuum. I knew that there's a point where you get to, where I get to in building a model that I say, okay, that could be complete. And then I decide, do I want to keep going? Because there's always little touches you can keep adding and keep adding and keep adding. I've done that with models. I'm just having fun with it, and I just want to keep weathering and keep weathering and keep weathering and keep wearing. On this model, let me state it this way. I'm having fun with it, but I'm starting to look at other projects more longingly than I'm looking at this one. And I think I'm gonna go ahead and put all the parts on and take a look at it and say, do I want to do anything else? Because I'm at the point that I think I could call this a completed model. It's not heavily weathered, but it's weathered. And I'm happy with, if I call this finished, I think I'm happy with it. I want to get the other parts on just to see. But keep that in mind when you're working on your models. Consider that idea of the finishing being a zone, not a point. And just deciding, have I said what I want to say with this model, whether you're going to be the only one looking at it or not. Now I will say, I enjoy this kit. I've built this kit quite a few times, and I'm really enjoying this kit. But like I said, I've got some other projects in the works that I'm way more excited about those Because I feel like there's only, now that I did aircraft for many years and I enjoyed weathering them. And then when I switched to sci-fi and started doing everything from, you know, machining Krieger stuff to Warhammer tanks and things like that, I suddenly discovered that I have a love for heavy weathering. I mean, really heavy weathering. And you can only get away with so much on a World War II aircraft. And one of the things that I've discovered as I've gotten back now, this being the second plane I've built in quite a few years, having built hundreds from 2006 to about 2018, I'm discovering I like the weathering far more than anything else. And you can only get away with so much on an airplane before it starts looking kind of ridiculous. And at least in my opinion. So I'm going to put the prop on. I'm going to put the wheels on. I'm going to put the antennas on. You know, all the extra pieces that I've left off. I'm going to leave the masking in the doors, and I'm just going to take a look at it. I'm going to see if I want to do any additional steps. If I do, I'll show you. But if not, I may just, if I look at it and go, that's what I want, then I may just hit it with a matte coat, take the masking off, take the canopy masking off, glue the doors on as the final step, and call it a day. So let me get everything glued on, and then we'll see where it goes from there. So I guess I'll call that done. I'm pretty happy with it. I could have done more. I didn't do any post shading. I didn't do any additional distressing of the paint and weathering and stuff like that. I mean, I think it gets the point across. It's a model of a P-39. So I don't think anybody will mistake it for a can of peas or an aardvark. I like how the exhaust staining came out. That worked out pretty good. And you can see in the cockpit and see some of the details. And I got the drop tank mounted underneath there, landing gear and all that stuff. It's a bit fiddly. I'd forgotten. It's been so many years since I've done an aircraft. I'd forgotten how fiddly it is at the end to put on the landing gear and the machine guns and the pitot tube and the antennas, and I had to go back to being a bit careful with how I handled everything, but forgotten that part. But overall, I'm happy with it. This is really a very good kit, even though it's I think it's over, if I remember right, it's over 20 years old, certainly around 20 years old. Maybe older than that, I don't remember. But it's a good kit, and I highly recommend it. Like I think I talked about in one of the earlier videos, I've not built the Arma Hobbies P-39, so I don't know how this compares. I don't know that maybe eventually I'll build one. I don't know. But I've got another Eduard P-39 sitting on the shelf, unbuilt, so I don't anticipate getting a kit of something that I already have. But if you're looking for a P-39, one of the things I've noted is, because Eduard is still releasing this kit at various times, is I haven't, and again, I've not built the Arma Hobby, so I'm coming at it from that direction. But in looking at the parts and listening to videos where people talk about the construction, I didn't see anything that made me think it stood out that much further in terms of fit and detail and all of that stuff as the Eduard P-39. What I did notice is the Eduard P-39, when they released the weekend edition, which allows you to build any P-39 kit, any P-39 variant, was way cheaper. And again, in my own evaluation, just looking at photos and things online, I didn't see anything that made me think, wow, the other one is worth paying twice as much, or whatever it was. So if you can get one of these at a bargain, then don't feel like you're getting an old kit that doesn't have any detail. This is a very good kit that still holds up to modern standard. Also very happy to see that the nose weight worked and it's not a tail sitter. So I can make it, try and make it tail sit, but it won't do it. So they got the nose weight just right. So that's great for that. Anyway, I'm gonna call this a video. Thanks for watching. Thanks for sticking around to the end, and I hope that maybe there's been some benefit to this, and that you've been able to glean something from it that you can use in your own model building. And as I always do, I'll wrap up with one final thought. If you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.